David Hirsh, welcome to my podcast. Nice to have you with us today.
Thank you very much. Hi, good morning.
Good morning to you. You're to let our listeners know who you are. You're a professor of sociology at Goldsmiths, University of London, and you're also the co-founder of Engage, which is a company or an organization that works against anti-Semitism in England.
That's right. We set up the Engage Network back in 2004 in response to the campaign to boycott Israeli academia. In fact, really, the Engage project has, to an extent, come to an end. And for the last 3 years, we've been building the London Centre for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism.
And how would you, just to dive into that, how would you differentiate between contemporary anti-Semitism and anti-Semitism in itself?
Well, that's a good question. I think there's a number of ways in which one can take that apart. But I guess the point about focusing on contemporary anti-Semitism is that a lot of people who are interested in anti-Semitism, and everybody says that they're against anti-Semitism, everybody's very comfortable talking about older forms of anti-Semitism. But contemporary anti-Semitism is much more controversial and much more contested. So that's really the force of putting the word contemporary into the title.
Yeah. And speaking of academic boycott, I'm here in Norway, as you know, and especially here in Norway, I think we've seen a lot of this academic boycott against Israel. And how much would you say that an academic boycott of Israel is also an expression of anti-Semitism implicit in that?
Well, firstly, what is very easy to demonstrate, I think, is that one of the effects of a campaign to boycott Israeli academics is anti-Semitism in the place in which you're making the argument for the boycott. So in our case, our experience was in the trade unions, the academic trade unions in Britain. And when the boycott campaign came into the trade union and was legitimized, was treated as a legitimate campaign in the union, it's one of its results was anti-Semitism. It needs to create an emotional response strongly enough to make people want to vote to exclude Israelis from our campuses and our journals and our conferences. And it inevitably brings in all kinds of tropes and images of older anti-Semitisms. But that wasn't quite your question. So the easy thing is to show that anti-Zionism and the boycotts have an anti-Semitic effect. What's more difficult is, and I don't remember your words now, but your words was, is it an expression of, I think. In other words, what I'm hearing is, to what extent is the wish to boycott Israeli academics but no others motivated by anti-Semitism? To what extent is it itself an expression of anti-Semitism? And we always shied away from that question a little bit because it was much easier to talk about the effects, the anti-Semitic effects of anti-Zionism, which is spot on and absolutely true. But I also think that you can't really understand that kind of exclusionary anti-Zionism unless you understand it in relation to older anti-Semitic movements. And I don't think you can understand why the boycott movement against Israel is unique. I mean, in other words, my trade union doesn't call for a boycott of anybody else, right? All through the Cold War, even at the moment, one wouldn't dream of boycotting Russian or Chinese academics. If somebody works at a Chinese university, then you say, oh, poor you must have a lot of trouble. It must be difficult for you and perhaps frightening to operate properly as an academic. And we offer you our solidarity. and we work with you, and if we get the opportunity to talk to you about Chinese politics, then that's great. That has always been the way that academics engage with each other. Only with Israeli academics do we make it, or is there even a thought of making a precondition to engage with Israeli academics that they, well, actually, it's quite an interesting question what the precondition is. So it started off just a sort of boycott of Israelis. And then people said, well, what about the good Israelis? And, the good Israelis or the good people with Israeli citizenship would be Israelis who are not Jewish or Israelis who disavow Israel. So what about the good Israelis? And then people said, well, if somebody makes a clear statement against Israeli apartheid or Israeli colonial settlerism, or in our day, it would be against Israeli genocide. If somebody makes a clear statement, then they can be exempted from the boycott. And that is kind of so obviously a form of McCarthyism, a form of making a judgment about who should be blacklisted and who should not. The boycott movement never really held on to that for very long, and they moved to what they thought was a smarter idea, which was the rhetoric around the idea of institutional boycott. So they said, we won't boycott individuals, we won't boycott Israelis, but we'll boycott Israeli institutions, because we can demonstrate that Israeli institutions are complicit with Israeli apartheid, Israeli genocide, Israeli occupation, whatever it is. And the problem with that, of course, is that that just creates an exclusion of Israeli individuals, or it recreates the problem of McCarthyism, because then sometimes they say, well, we're happy to have an Israeli speak so long as he or she doesn't say that they're here that they're here in an official capacity from their university. So again, there's the kind of demand to disavow, to gain exceptional status by disavowing your university or your community of scholarship, or your nation, or your or disavow your imputed politics. And that's very important too, by the way, because if I was to say, well, look, I've got a 40-year record of speaking against and working against genocide and against racism and against the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, so therefore I should be exempted from the boycott. That's not enough. The only way to gain an exemption as an exceptional Jew is to mirror the precise wording that the boycott movement offers you. And that would be, in our day and age, to say, to kind of confess to Israeli genocide and to confess to Israeli misuse of anti-Semitism in a conspiracy to delegitimize, silence criticism of Israel. And if you do those two things, then you can gain exceptional status, you can be exempted from the opprobrium, but you might have to repeat your disavowal many times and on demand.
It also almost gives me images in my head when you're speaking about this of like medieval Europe and crusades, and you have to confess your sins and repent or else.
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, we're used to thinking about Nazism, and Nazism was the one exceptional form of anti-Semitism which allowed no exceptions. Nazism was racialized, and therefore it said that every Jew in their race, in their racial makeup, is a threat. But all previous anti-Semitisms offered, at least in principle, offered exemptions generally to people who would convert to Christianity. Although, to what extent those exemptions were really honored is another question. They might exempt you from the Inquisition, but they would still be putting bits of pork and seafood into the paella and making sure they saw you eat a bit, or watching your chimney to make sure there was smoke coming out of it on Shabbat, and they wouldn't let you marry their daughters, So the exemption itself was never really quite as clear as it was supposed to be.
Would you say also that splitting Jews into like the good Jews and the bad Jews is also a mechanism of anti-Semitism itself? And it almost, to me, it seems like the word Israel and Israeli is just a proxy for actually saying the word Jew, because we're not there yet that you could say the word Jew, but it's a proxy for saying Jew. And then in turn, splitting people up into good Jews who have the right opinions and the bad Jews who have the wrong opinions. And how much of that is like classic mechanisms of anti-Semitism, that's splitting?
Yeah, well, I'll come back to there's 2 points there. One is about the word Israel substituting for the word Jew, and I might come back to that if you want. But this question about good Jews is interesting, I think, because you need to think it through, right? Now, we are used to having this concept in other contexts. So, for example, people might think that, good gay people who live a good, upright, clean, living, monogamous life are fine. It's just the bad ones we hate, right? The bad ones who are all camp and effeminate and who they have lots of different sexual partners, etc., etc. The ones who subvert our culture. It's the bad gay people we hate, and the good gay people are fine. And of course, everybody has long recognized that distinction is really a kind of homophobic distinction. And so that's where this idea comes from. Or you can do the same with race or with gender. We like good, proper, upright women. We like Margaret Thatcher, but we don't like these kind of awful, screaming feminists. That's how the argument goes. So we endow full rights to upright, respectable women or gay people or black people, but we still carry on our campaign against the bad ones. Now, formally, of course, that's right. If there are bad people, we should, arrest them or campaign against them or whatever it is they're accused of doing. Formally, there are bad Jews, right? But the trope of the bad Jew is an anti-Semitic trope. And then what happens is it gets kind of put upside down, because anti-Zionist Jews, people who embrace various aspects of anti-Semitic politics, they then kind of come up with the challenge and they say, I suppose you're going to say I'm the bad Jew. And then again, you can't just be satisfied with these phrases and how they land. You have to kind of think it through. So what would that mean? That would mean that anti-Semitism exempts good Jews, quotes, which are, I don't know, sort of good Zionist, Islamophobic Jews, but would reject anti-Zionist Jews. But that's not what the claim is. The claim is against the Jewish community itself, designating some people as bad Jews and good Jews. So often the kind of terminology is turned upside down. Anti-Zionist Jews very often kind of parade their Jewish identity. And again, in a break from identity politics. Normally with identity politics, people say, well, having lived a life as a woman or having lived a life as a black person, I have certain access to understandings that you might not have, and therefore my understanding might be in some ways more accurate than yours. So people kind of say that as a consequence of their identity, they have knowledge that people who are privileged don't necessarily have. That's not what anti-Zionist Jews are doing. What anti-Zionist Jews are doing is kind of relying on their identity in order to give evidence against the rest of the Jewish community. Not to say my Jewishness means that I have an experience of anti-Semitism that you might not understand, but to say my Jewishness means that I have an experience of Jews and how bad they really are in secret, and I'm coming to tell you the truth. And of course, again, that's a kind of inversion of identity politics. So sometimes I sound like the professor who's kind of trying to be too careful and too clever. But I really do think that we need to go beyond the way words and phrases look and really follow through their origins and their meanings.
Yeah, definitely. What do you think about I think it's an artificial divide between when people say that, hey, I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm just an anti-Zionist, I'm against the idea of Zionism. That doesn't make me anti-Semitic. What do you think about that attempt at distinction?
Well, I think firstly, that we need to understand that the subjective self-consciousness of anti-Zionists, right? What they think about themselves is that they speak in good faith. And I think they do speak in good faith. I think, Jeremy Corbyn is a true believer. I think he does not believe he's an anti-Semite. He believes his anti-Zionism is completely devoid of anti-Semitism. And it would be wrong to say that he uses anti-Zionism in order to cloak or to hide his anti-Semitism. So firstly, the way people present themselves is real. And it's more difficult, right? If people were just cynically lying, it would be easier to deal with than if people were true believers who really believe that they're the good guys. So first point. Second point is that in the abstract, or perhaps in history actually, for sure, there was in history in the 1910s, 1920s, there were anti-Zionists who were not anti-Semitic. That, Zionism was a proposal, a project, a politics, and there were other proposals and other projects and other politics. In fact, the three main kind of radical left, more or less left political projects to deal with anti-Semitism in early 20th century Europe were Zionism, Bundism, and kind of universalistic socialism or Bolshevism. And so there were anti-Zionists in that debate who made an argument against Zionism as a program, as a way of dealing with anti-Semitism, and that's fine. It was perfectly possible to make an argument against Zionism and not be anti-Semitic. The difference, though, is, and this is interesting because a lot of the anti-Zionists are quite kind of big macho Marxist historical materialists, or they present themselves as being so. But what they miss are the kind of huge world-changing material changes in Jewish life over the last 100 years. So they just say, well, the critique of Zionism in 1910 is the same as my critique of Zionism today in 2025. And it's not anti-Semitic. What they miss, and they miss out, is the increasing anti-Semitism in Europe and in the Middle East and in Russia after the revolution. And what they miss out is the Holocaust. And what they miss out is the war of 1948 and actually also of 1967 and 1973. In other words, Zionism is presented as an idea put forward by Herzl, and it's presented as being a racist idea because it says Jews can't live together with everybody else and they have to live separately, and that's a racist idea. And that's why Herzl's idea in the late 19th century now creates Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, who are racist in 2025. And there's a kind of unbroken line from one to the other. What they miss out, of course, is the fact that material life for Jews is completely altered from how it was 100 years ago. Jews do not live in the same places that they lived 100 years ago. Jews 100 years ago lived mainly in the cities of the Middle East, in Russia, and in Eastern and Central Europe. They don't live there anymore, right? Jews today live in North America and they live in Israel. End. Full stop. Period. I mean, there are some Jewish communities, obviously, in other places, in Britain and France, in Germany, and Australia. But fundamentally, half the Jews in the world live in North America and half live in Israel. Jewish life changed, and therefore the meaning of anti-Zionism, what anti-Zionism is as a movement, is completely different from a critique of an idea. And after the Holocaust, after 1948, the meaning of being an anti-Zionist, of somebody saying, well, the state of Israel is a block to peace and justice. And so long as the state of Israel exists, there can be no peace and justice in the world. That's a problem. It's not true. It's bad advice to Palestinians, and it's also anti-Semitic. Why is it anti-Semitic? Because it then treats Israeli nationalists in a way completely different from how we relate to any other nationalists on the planet. And anyway, it's even possible that one could relate to Israeli nationalists in the same way as we relate to all the others, but it could have a different effect. Let me explain that. I was in Canada not long ago. If you're in Canada, people say, well, of course, Canada is a settler colonial society. Everybody knows it, and we all admit it, and we're very ashamed of it, and we try to address it. Well, fine, but if somebody calls you a settler colonialist and you're an Israeli, it means they want to kill you. If somebody calls you a settler colonialist, you're Canadian, it means that they want to, go to Starbucks with you and share guilt. So, firstly, the way people respond to Israel and to Israeli nationalism is different. But even if it wasn't, it could still be different in effect.
How do you define Zionism when people ask you, no, what is Zionism? Because let me just wrap that question in a little bit, because when I define Zionism, I tell people, like, Zionism is just the idea that Jews should have a home state, which is called Israel, like a safe haven, an emergency exit from everywhere in the world, that you could at least go there if there are new pogroms and attacks against Jews. That's a place you can go, a Jewish state where Jews can live. And then, but what I'm often met with, then, if I define it like that, then they say, no, it's not just one type of Zionism. There are so many other types of definitions of Zionism. You have this military Zionism, and you have that Zionism. It's like 10 different definitions. So you can't just define that. There are like, so what is your answer to that, and how do you define Zionism?
So my answer in general is to stubbornly refuse to define Zionism. And let me explain why. When somebody accuses me of being not a real sociologist, but a Zionist sociologist, what they mean is, what they are accusing me of is being somebody who uses the language and the kind of clever constructions of sociology in order to support the oppressors and the murderers in the Middle East, to support genocide, to support apartheid, to support racism. So that somebody who's using the shapes of sociology against the values of sociology. That's what they mean. Now, if somebody calls me a Zionist, I'm not going to say, no, you've got it all wrong. My Zionism is actually really lovely. I'm just going to say, no, fuck off. Don't call me a racist and a fake and a liar and a genocider. Just as, like it used to be kind of ABC of anti-racism, that race does not appear in the world, in the natural world, right? Race doesn't appear in the natural world. Race is a construction of racists, and race takes particular potential differences of human beings, and it makes out of them something huge and symbolic and determinative. But race in itself doesn't exist. In itself is about trivial differences amongst human beings. And so racism defines race. Now, lots of Black people would be quite upset about that, and they'll say, well, don't tell me I'm not really Black. How dare you? Which is an absolutely fair point. But there is every difference in the world from your own self-empowering and rather beautiful identification as Black on the one hand, and the way you might get identified as Black when you're walking down a street late at night by white racists, or when you walk into a job interview or whatever. That's the key way in which you get identified as Black by racism. And in my view, we need to kind of oppose that in its own terms. And so I may or may not have a very beautiful and liberating and lovely notion of my own Zionism, but I don't want to talk to you about it in the context of a discussion about anti-Semitism. I just want to say, no, when you call me a Zionist, you're calling me a racist, and I'm not a racist. And that is a kind of anti-Semitic way of using the term.
But how do you define Zionism yourself?
Yes, very good. So having refused to define Zionism, you're quite right to ask me the question again, which I may or may not be stubborn with for a second time, but I'm in a good mood, so I will relent. I think that, you see, there is a point, right, that a friend of mine came back from Israel once and he said, you know, I saw some Zionists walking around in Tel Aviv, right? The kids from a Zionist youth movement wearing the, whatever they are, the blue shirts with red laces on their necks. And he said they were Zionists walking around in Tel Aviv, but most people just looked ordinary, looked normal. They didn't look like Zionists. And he said, Israelis are Israelis. My grandmother was a Zionist, you know, she learned Hebrew and made kind of like rediscovered absurd folk dances that they did around the campfire and preparing to go and move to Palestine. She was a Zionist, but Israelis are not. Israelis are just Israelis. The Israeli government is just a government, and it does what it believes to be in the interests of the state, and it's very normal. And there is a threat in defining Israel as the Zionist entity or some such word, because there's a real payoff for anti-Zionism to portray itself as critics of a movement. If I was to say I'm going to define my whole worldview against France, and you know, France, the existence of France is a block to anything good in the world, because you know, France came into being through the revolution, but it's never been properly democratic, blah, blah, blah. It would be easy to construct an argument. And then I say, well, what do you want to do? And you say, well, I want to eradicate France. So everybody would immediately think that's weird. Why do you want to eradicate France, but not Italy or Paraguay? And it would be weird to say, I want to eradicate Israel. It sounds less weird if you say, I want to eradicate the Zionist entity or the Zionist movement. Why? Because an entity or a movement can be wrong. A movement can be a totalitarian movement or a Nazi movement, and you can want to defeat it. But the aspiration to defeat a nation state is of a different kind. So again, there are ways of using the term Zionism in relation to Israel that are itself symptomatic of the problem. So you'll notice that, again, for a second time, I have indeed stubbornly refused to tell you what my Zionism is. I don't mind. I mean, for quite a long time, I kind of refused a third time by saying, oh, God, my Microsoft is doing something peculiar. For a third time, you can cut that bit out. For a third time, I might say, well, I was, you know, politically formed on the left, and we were against nationalism, and we were against all nationalism. And therefore, as a Jewish person who opposes anti-Semitism, why shouldn't I be against Israeli nationalism as I'm against all other nationalism? That's no longer my position, if it ever was, really just in two quite specific ways. One is this, that Israel, I want to say it in this kind of slightly mystical, not Jewish mystical, but kind of Stalinist mystical. History has endowed the state of Israel with two different requirements. One of them is to be the Jewish state. Israel is the Jewish state. Why? Because Jews needed asylum, because if Jews ever need asylum again, then it will guarantee that they will get asylum, because being Jewish in the diaspora is facilitated by the existence of the state of Israel. That's quite an interesting question, actually. I did an exam, a viva of a PhD once, where somebody described the faction fight within British Judaism, British Jewish community in the late 40s and the early 50s about Zionism. Should we embrace Zionism? And I listened, I read his thesis and I listened to him talking. And so, of course, the end of the story is, interestingly, this is an aside, but it's an interesting one. The non-Zionists in the British Jewish community were largely people who'd been in England for generations, and they were largely Sephardic, actually, from Spain and Portugal and from the East. And the radicals, the Zionists, were largely refugees from Europe, who were kind of much more fresh refugees from the pogroms in Eastern and Central Europe and from the Holocaust. And so there was this kind of fight amongst British Jews, and the old English Jews said, no, don't make a fuss, don't be vulgar, don't, let the English think that you're into all these revolutionary ideologies like communism and Zionism and anarchism, because they won't like it. Let us whisper into the ears of the powerful and they'll look after you and it will be fine. And if we say that we're Zionists, if we say that we, are Israeli nationalists, then they'll think that we're not properly British. So that was the kind of fear. On the other hand, they lost that, and the British Jewish community did indeed define itself as Zionist. So then you think, well, what happened next? Well, of course, they all packed their bags, 250,000 or 300,000 British Jews packed their bags and went to live in Israel. Except they didn't, right? So what did it mean that they defined a Zionist without going to live in Israel? And what it meant, actually, was that they were trying to find a way to remain British. And this was not a simple question, right? We're talking about 4 or 5 years after a very serious and significantly successful attempt to wipe out the Jews of the whole of Europe. And Jews in Britain are trying to work out how can they be British? Are they British, or are they Israeli, or what are they? And interestingly, I think that by adopting Zionism, by adopting a kind of ideology of connecting themselves to the state of Israel, what they did was to make it possible for them to remain British. So the opposite of the fear of the old English anti-Zionists, which was, if we're Zionists, then people will think that we're disloyal. The opposite. What happened was that people embraced Zionism, and that enabled them to remain as loyal British Jews. And perhaps that's one of the reasons why anti-Zionism is so threatening to Jews in the diaspora, because it removes from them the thing that they found which enabled them to remain British or to remain American or to remain French. It's interesting. I like it because it's anti-intuitive, right? But what actually happened was anti-intuitive, that they embraced Zionism, but they stayed in Britain. And then I was trying to work through why and how. Oh gosh, there you go. For a fourth time, I've refused to answer your question about my own Zionism.
That's fine. That's fine. I want to go back to.
I was going to say I'm getting there, but no, you've let me off the hook now. So
Yeah. I want to go back to a different questions that we were just talking a little bit about, but we never really got into the question of, is Israel actually a proxy for being Jewish? Like, is the word Israeli actually just a safer proxy for people to say instead of actually saying Jew?
Right. So, as I said, I think it's quite important that it's not a trick, right? Anti-Zionists are not people who know that they are anti-Semitic and who know that they hate Jews and who are using Israel as a proxy. I mean, some people are, right? There are anti-Semites who are adopting anti-Zionism as a proxy, but that's not the key problem that we see, certainly in the West. So how does it work? And I think the way it works is that again, it's not my claim that Zionism is the same as Judaism, or that it's all right. So let's start by saying it's kind of an empirical fact that the overwhelming majority of Jews have some kind of quite profound relationship to the state of Israel, which is buried quite deep inside their Jewish identity. To use a technical way of saying it, we say that some kind of attachment to Israel is a non. Oh gosh, now I've forgotten the technical term we use. That's right. It's a non-contingent, rationally intelligible aspect of nearly all Jewish identities. What does that mean? Non-contingent means I don't just choose whether to be a Zionist or not. It's not just a kind of abstract political choice. People are Zionist because, for all sorts of reasons, right? Everybody knows that a Jew who ended up in Britain or in France or in Israel or in South Africa or in Australia, it's random, right? Some families found asylum here, some families found asylum there, some people had to go to Shanghai or to Chile. It's random. So the idea that everyone in Israel is somehow, evil, and that is the claim, right? That they are genocidal and racist and apartheid. Those are ways of saying evil. Whereas all Jews it was random where we ended up. And, I have plenty of cousins in Israel and in other places. So firstly, it's kind of random. It's not just a political choice. It's non-contingent. And there are other ways of thinking that through. People who sit in a synagogue on a Saturday, every Saturday morning, they talk about the stories of the Jewish tradition. And those stories happened in Israel, mainly in the West Bank, actually. Does that mean I'm now relying on a religious, justification that God gave us the land of Israel and blah, blah, blah? No, not at all. Not at all. I'm just saying that Zionism, some kind of attachment to the state of Israel, is not just random. It's not just a sort of political cloak you can take on or put off. And secondly, it's rationally intelligible. In other words, if most Jews embraced some kind of if most Jews actually embraced genocide, it would not be enough to say, well, it's okay because most Jews embrace it, and if I was critical of it, then I would be anti-Semitic. And the difference is that the Zionism of the overwhelming majority of Jews is in one way or another rationally intelligible. It's not mad. It's not bad. It's not evil. It's a kind of completely understandable worldview, politics. And it's funny, isn't it? People like, I don't know, Desmond Tutu, but many people since have said that it's shocking that the Jews didn't learn from the Holocaust. They didn't learn, proper left liberal egalitarian values from the Holocaust. It's a crazy claim. I mean, even firstly, because the Holocaust was not a yeshiva, right? It was not a learning experience. And secondly, because the thing that people did learn from the Holocaust was next time, don't sit around and wait for the international community and international democratic norms to save you, because they might not. In other words, next time, make sure you have the capacity for self-defense. And that may be right, it may be wrong, but it's certainly rationally intelligible. It's not mad, right? So the overwhelming majority of Jews have Zionism not just as a choice, but as something quite profound inside their Jewish identity. Was that the question?
Yeah, and it's almost like that banal expression of "fool me once, shame on you," and "fool me twice, shame on me." Right? It's like the story of being Jewish is pogroms and is Jewish persecution and it's mass murder and it's like I feel like in this day and age it's obvious why we need an Israeli state. It's obvious why we need Zionism. It's obvious why we need a kind of a blue emergency exit in whatever country we're in, so that we're always having Israel as a safe haven to go to. And I was thinking when you were speaking about this word genocide, and I feel like that also, if you take the bird's eye view, I think that the word genocide is just one of the latest words used to smear Jews, because anti-Semitism takes so many forms, right? It can be in the form of um, of apartheid, in the form of anti-Zionism, in the form of being against our faith or being against our race and our blood, or being against Jews because the Jews killed Jesus, and this whole thing is like it's so flexible, the anti-Semitism. And what I'm getting to is I feel like genocide is just the latest word that's used to smear Jews, and it has a different dimension to it also, because from the Middle Ages, from the medievals, we had the blood libels, and do you also feel, because that's my take, do you feel like the word genocide in particular is used to smear Jews as almost a parallel to the blood libels from the Middle Ages?
Yes, I do. I think all the different manifestations of anti-Semitism that you list, I think they are all different. They happen at different times and places, and in different kinds of human societies. But I also think that they have quite a lot in common with each other. Blood libel is a strange history, which goes back to not all of Christianity, but certain Christian traditions. They were perplexed, and they couldn't understand why Jews didn't embrace the Gospels. Right, that this idea that the Torah, the story of the Torah, was a kind of progression, a seeking towards the universal and one God and the universal ethics. And Christianity says, well, the Jews never found it. They never got to the end of the rainbow, but we have, and we have now a universal religion. And why don't you love it? Why don't you accept it? Especially because Jesus is one of yours anyway. And so there's a kind of perplexity and then an anger. What is it with these Jews? And this is an important point, that anti-Semitism very often doesn't only accuse the Jews of kind of neglecting their own salvation, but it accuses the Jews of screwing up salvation for all of us. And that's very important, that the Jews are not just kind of saddos who will be miserable, but the Jews are saddos who are a block between us, between human beings and progress, between human beings and utopia, or just human beings in a better world. So that idea of Jews not only screwing it up for themselves, but for everybody is very important. That the business of the Jews and the foolishness of the Jews and the cruelty of the Jews becomes the business of humanity as a whole. I mean, nobody says that about this or that ethnic group in Congo or in Myanmar, right? It's a kind of local issue that nobody really understands. But everybody thinks they understand Israel and Palestine, because it becomes a passion play. It becomes something that concerns us all, and it becomes a whole load of symbolic material with which we construct our own identities, and within which we tell each other who we are, and within which we do our own stuff. So blood libel was the accusation in medieval times that if something awful happened, and the most awful thing that happens in a community is a child gets murdered, actually. And if you don't know who did it, who do you blame? And people liked to blame the Jews. And there arose a culture of blaming the Jews for child murders that couldn't be solved otherwise, not blaming a particular Jewish person, but blaming the Jews corporately together, all of them. And around that were myths of Jews as murderers of God, which is an absolute evil. It's not an evil for material gain, but it's an absolute evil. And also stuff about blood, that the reason Jews wanted to murder children was to reenact the crucifixion and to consume blood, to consume the blood of non-Jewish children. Excuse me. So every anti-Semitic movement that I'm aware of has accused Jews of murdering children. And so when I see today the accusation in absolutely mainstream legitimate places, in universities, in BBC News, the accusation being treated as legitimate that Jews are involved in the deliberate murder of thousands of children, then it makes you stop and think, like, either it's true, in which case that would be the first time, or it's got more in common with anti-Semitic blood libel than anybody can understand. And it's interesting too that if somebody says, Israel is murdering children, and if I then talk about blood libel, people just roll their eyes and go, "Oh gosh, this is a very serious allegation. You can't just pretend that it's anti-Semitic." Well, firstly, that's what people always do when one raises the issue of anti-Semitism. They always say, what you're doing is just a kind of trick to try to stop us criticizing Israel. But secondly, the allegation, so is it true? No, it's not true. Genocide. And there's also something specific about the history of the term genocide, right? It's not just an abstract term, right? Genocide was formulated after the experience of the Holocaust. It was not a new phenomenon, but it was a phenomenon that had been demonstrated in an unprecedented way during the Holocaust, and that there was a new determination to give a name to understand. And genocide is not just something which results in many deaths, right? I've seen PhD theses about whether the cigarette trade is genocide because it predictably leads to the deaths of millions and millions of people. And it's not genocide. Why is it not genocide? Because it is not conducted with the intent to destroy in whole or in part the cigarette smoking population. And actually, the knowledge that it may or may not lead to deaths is not enough, is not the point. So we then come back to the war in Israel, the war in Gaza, and you kind of ask, well, what is it actually? Is it a genocide? Is it a conspiracy by Israel to destroy the Palestinians of Gaza completely, or in part? Is that why they're doing this? Is that why they're doing all this, why all this destruction is happening in Gaza? Is it because the Israelis are trying to destroy the Palestinians? And the answer is no. The answer is that it was Hamas that attacked Israel. It was Hamas that killed 1,000 Jews in a day. And it was Hamas that used large-scale sexual violence as a political weapon. And it was Hamas that took something like 250 hostages. And it was also, on that day, something like 300 Israelis died having to defend their communities and prevent there from being more deaths, so combatant. And Hamas run away and they go back to Gaza and they say, well, you can't follow us. You can't follow us and engage us and defeat us because we're going to go back and hide amongst civilian people. And to do that, to follow us and engage with us and defeat us would necessarily result in many, many civilian deaths. And therefore, there's nothing you can do. And by the way, we're going to do this again when we can. And the Israelis said, well, we wish you wouldn't, We wish you didn't. But if you're going to kill 1,000 Jews in a day and then run away, we're going to come after you. And if you're going to hide amongst civilian people, then I'm sorry, but we're going to come after you there. Now, you might think that's right. You might think it's wrong. You might think there were other possibilities or other options. But whatever you think, it's not genocide. It's not even anything like genocide. And I think the debate about genocide really misunderstands what genocide is and how it works. And I've studied genocide. I've studied the Holocaust, and I wrote my PhD thesis on genocide and actually Rwanda and Bosnia and other instances. And genocide is not the byproduct of a war. Genocide is a campaign, an intention to destroy other human collectives by murdering them. So, given that this is not genocide, and given that the allegation of deliberately murdering thousands of Israeli children resonates with all of anti-Semitic history, then I think it's completely reasonable to think of this current campaign to designate Israel as genocidal. And by the way, Israel is not just a normal state that is accused of having, deteriorated in some way, that it committed genocide and it can then recover. Israel is not Germany, right, which had this terrible moment of Nazism and then fixed it. Israel is inherently genocidal and genocidal in its logic. So I think that living in a world where it is completely normal and legitimate to say that Israel deliberately murders thousands of children is a world in which anti-Semitism has become a legitimate claim in public life.
Would you say that there's also parallel between Holocaust revisionism and in that saying that, the Jews were probably a little bit guilty of their own Holocaust or their own extinction, that kind of Holocaust revisionism, a parallel between that and saying that Israel is committing genocide after October 7th? Is there a parallel between those?
So it is a trope of anti-Zionism that comes up again and again and again, which is that Zionism was a movement that was like Nazism. It came out of the same milieu as Nazism, and it was in collaboration with Nazism. So common sense notion might be that the Jews and the Zionists were against Nazism, but anti-Zionism very often insists that Zionists were Nazis, that they collaborated, that their ideology is a racial ideology like Nazism. And that's why, for example, whenever Holocaust Memorial Day rolls round, I'm like hiding. I'm like, oh gosh, Holocaust Memorial Day again. We know what's going to happen today. We know that there's going to be a whole load of anti-Semitism. And the higher profile it gets on, TV and the rest of it, the worse it is. And partly because we know that everybody all over the country is going to be saying, well, look, the Jews do this too. Or the Jews were always doing this. Zionism always was genocidal. So I do think that. And of course, by the way, Hamas does indeed openly state that it has an intent to destroy in whole Jews. It states it in its founding document. Like, astonishingly, at some point, it kind of said, oh, yes, well, let's make a new document. But they never said, well, coming into being in order to achieve Nazi-style genocidal anti-Semitism was a mistake, and now we're going to change our constitution and we're going to be about democratic secular state. I mean, like, you have to account for that if that's your trajectory, right? If you say, well, yeah, Nazi genocidal anti-Semitism was an error, but really we're for democracy, and then you kill 1,000 Jews in a day, by the way, and killing 1,000 Jews in a day is not irrelevant. I mean, like, in human history, many, many massacres of 1,000 people have happened, and mass rape, and it's not unusual, right? But killing 1,000 Jews in a day in a world where the Holocaust has happened, it's different. I mean, imagine if there was a movement which started enslaving black people and making them work on farms in the fields. People would say, like, not only is this bad, but this, like, directly reminds us of and mirrors the horrors of the Atlantic slave trade. Obviously, they would say that, because how could it not remind you of that? So the fact of a bunch of genocidal anti-Semites murdering 1,000 Jews in a day and then saying we would like to do it again if we can is particular in a world where the Holocaust has happened.
Would you say that anti-Semitism is more of an subconscious thing, that rather than a conscious thing that people know that they are enacting and acting it out, like it's part of the zeitgeist of the Western world? It's something that it's more of the abstract. We can't really touch it. We don't even know that it's there. It's almost like people who are doing anti-Semitic acts and or saying words is like almost not the rhythm of responsibility. But do you think this happens more on a subconscious level in society than actually conscious level?
Well, I do think that, but I also think that to the extent that that's true, I think it's not unusual. So I think, in the 80s, right, there was this kind of anti-racist consciousness raising, right, where people would sit in a circle and they would begin like a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, and they'd say, "Hello, my name's David Hirsh, and I'm a racist," and then they'd go to the next person, right? And it's a bit icky, right? But you get the point, right? The point is that you don't become not racist just by deciding that you're against racism and by resolving you're not going to be racist, any more than you get thin by deciding not to eat biscuits, right? You have to actually not eat the biscuits. And so, like, we know that. We know that structures of discrimination are complicated and they are external to any particular human being, and they have effects that people inside them are not aware of. And why would anti-Semitism be any different? It wouldn't, and it's not. So it's just a sort of foolishness, really, to imagine that that it's impossible for a Jewish person to be anti-Semitic, or it's impossible for a black person to be racist, or that anyone who's racist or sexist knows that nobody knows that they're sexist, right? Nobody says, "Oh yeah, I'm a man and I'm sexist," and well, not, but it's true. Like, not even Donald Trump does that, to be honest. He says, "No, we treat everyone as we find them," and we're like, no one thinks they're the bad guy, and nobody thinks they're the anti-Semite. That doesn't mean that they're not.
Yeah, we're going in for landing here, but a final question now. So, what can we do about all this? What can we do about this development of more and more anti-Semitism in our societies, and this development against Israel? And what do you think is the solution? What is the cure for an anti-Semitic society?
Well, let me say a couple of things. One is, let me use that as an excuse to talk about our work, because our work, I think, is particularly important. Doesn't everybody? Everybody who understands anything about anti-Semitism knows that there's a particular problem on campus, right? The campuses are particularly affected by anti-Semitism, and this is apparently strange, because we would expect the campuses to be less racist and not more racist, and less anti-Semitic, not more anti-Semitic. And the problem is that most people who know that there's a problem on campus cannot find a way to impact that. And there are all kinds of programs, and actually there's quite a lot of money being poured into various programs that give students some education or take them away for a weekend to toughen them up and give them some arguments and give them some. The problem is that when students then go back onto campus and they go inside their lecture theatres and they are taught anti-Semitic frameworks and anti-Semitic worldviews by anti-Semitic lecturers, that then all that other stuff doesn't really grip. The problem is inside the academic disciplines and inside the academia itself. There's also a lot of calls to kind of pressure university administrations to act. And I'm all in favor of university administrations acting. But again, university administrators are people who got to become powerful because they knew how to read the room. And then they know that they can't move against campus anti-Semitism because they know that most people think that most campus anti-Semitism is not anti-Semitic. And so when they go and say, you need to stop doing this and you need to stop saying that, then people say, oh, but what about our academic freedom? So again, the key work is inside academia, inside the disciplines, and that's what we are trying to do. We are a network of academics at the London Centre for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism. We're a network of academics, and it's very hard to be an academic who works either studying anti-Semitism or engaging with anti-Semitic academia. It's very hard. It's very hard because other people quite easily and naturally come to regard you as a racist. They treat you like you're a Nazi. And you can imagine somebody, some Nazi going into a sociology department and trying to get a hearing would be very difficult, right? So what we want to do is to recreate communities of scholarship for academics who are standing up against anti-Semitism and taking it seriously. You can't do scholarship. It's not an individual thing, right? You have to do it in communities, in collaboration. And you need infrastructure. You need jobs. You need career paths. You need research funding. You need places to publish. You need journals. You need places to publish books. And so the London Centre for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism is in the business of reconstructing communities of scholarship and the infrastructures of scholarship, not with the intent of kind of going away from academia, but with the intent of coming back into academia, challenging academic anti-Semitism, and really making some progress. It's hard and it's expensive, right? If you want to get into a debate with Judith Butler, you can't just knock on the door or turn up at a conference and start making speeches, right? You have to spend 2 years in a library writing a paper or a book. And before that, you have to do a PhD. And before that, you have to do, so creating academic careers, creating academic research outputs that can really engage in academia, that can then create teaching for undergraduates and postgraduates, that can then feed into reading lists, that can then begin to change the culture inside sociology, inside the humanities, inside Middle East studies, etc. It's an almost impossibly big task that we set ourselves, but that is our task. So we need lots of support, but we're doing pretty well. We just had a conference in London with about 400 people present, about 220 academic papers, and it was amazing. Some people there were literally kind of euphoric, spending time in an environment that was not anti-Semitic, where they could talk seriously about their research, about their ideas, about their work, and not be told, well, we all know that criticism of Israel is not the same as anti-Semitism, or, whatever kind of nonsense you have to deal with every single time you open your mouth. And many of them didn't understand that they were in a hostile environment day to day until they spent 3 days in an environment that was not hostile. And then they understood. Next year, the Contemporary Anti-Semitism Conference will be in Haifa in Israel. And the following year, it will be in Philadelphia. And so we're establishing this annual conference called Contemporary Anti-Semitism. We're establishing book publishing programs. We have a partnership with Routledge, journal publishing, seminars, and communities of fellowship, and research projects, research networks, and we hope research funding. So very ambitious and very exciting is what we're doing. And we need support, and we need help, and we need money. I was going to say, so there's another thing with that is that when I say all that to people, people very often say, well, we're in a crisis right now, and we don't have time for all that. And we need to change public opinion now. And fine, I'm all in favor of changing public opinion now. It's not my area of expertise. I'm not a marketing guy. I'm not a politician. If you know how to change public opinion, great, do it. I'm also in favor of academic research into how to change public opinion. This is a good thing. But we need long-term investment in anti-Semitism in the academic sphere. Otherwise, there will be nobody left on campus who's able to do this. You can't just rely on random Jewish academics to do it. Most of them don't have the skills, and they don't have the ability, the possibility, right? The kind of, a lot of people would just think, well, we have a problem with anti-Semitism at our university. Let's go and talk to the Jewish studies guys, and they'll tell us what to do. And the problem is they don't know what to do. They themselves are terrified. They're terrified because they want to carry on doing their research into 19th century Yiddish literature or whatever it is, and good luck to them. I'm in favor of them being able to do that. What they don't want to do is to put themselves into a position where people will treat them as standing in the dock to defend the crimes of Israel. And so Jewish academics, and even Jewish studies, and even Israel studies academics, don't necessarily have the skills or the knowledge or the willingness to do this work. We do, because we're all a bit crazy. And we need your support. So www.londonantisemitism.com.
Yeah, it's great work that you're doing, and I know our own Norwegian Torkel Brekke was there with you at the event, and also Vibeke Mo was there with you, and I strongly support the work that you do, and people should definitely go to, I mentioned the website once again, londonantisemitism.com, and I'm in there now, and you can go to About, and then you can click on Become a Friend, and then you can give money to your organization, either monthly or a one-time amount. So I encourage our listeners to go and do that and support the important work that you're doing.
Giving money is great, but really we just want people to be aware of what we're doing, to somehow become part of our community, to spread the word. You don't have to give us money, but put us in a room with people who've got lots of money and we will talk to them. That's great stuff. Torkel is great. I believe his book is brilliant, but I have not read it because it is in Norwegian, which is why we are translating it into English and publishing it in our own Routledge book series. So that's very exciting, and hopefully that will be out within a year.
That's great. David Hirsh, it was a pleasure talking to you today, and thank you so much for our fine conversation, and thank you so much for the work that you are doing with your organization.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.